Sarah Mitchell stood in the middle of what used to be her living room, but calling it that felt like a cruel joke now. The space was empty except for a few cardboard boxes stacked against the wall, filled with whatever she could fit from a life that had once felt so full. The afternoon light came through the bare windows at an angle that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. She'd taken down the curtains last week, along with the framed photos and the small decorative things that had made this apartment feel like home. Now it was just walls and echoes. She sat down on the worn carpet, her back against the wall, and stared at the eviction notice in her hands. She'd read it so many times the words had started to blur together, but the date stood out clear and sharp. She had 3 days. 3 days to figure out where she was going to go, what she was going to do, how she was going to survive. The paper trembled slightly in her grip, and she realized her hands were shaking. It hadn't always been like this. Just 8 months ago, she'd had a good job as a graphic designer at a marketing firm downtown. She'd loved that work, loved the creative challenge of it, the way she could lose herself in a project for hours. She'd been good at it too. Her boss had praised her eye for detail, her ability to understand what clients wanted even when they couldn't quite articulate it themselves. She'd felt proud walking into that office every morning, felt like she was building something. Then the company started having financial troubles. There were whispers in the break room, worried conversations that stopped when managers walked by. Sarah had told herself it would be fine, that they'd weather whatever storm was coming. But when the layoffs started, they were swift and brutal. Her entire department was eliminated in a single afternoon. She could still remember the feeling of walking out of that building with her belongings in a box. The same box that was now sitting across the room from her, repurposed for yet another unwanted move. She'd been confident at first. With her experience and portfolio, she'd thought finding new work would just take a few weeks, maybe a month or two at most. She'd sent out resumes, made calls, reached out to every contact in her network. But the economy was struggling, and it seemed like everyone was holding on tight to whatever positions they had. The interviews she did get never seemed to go anywhere. Always the same story. They were impressed with her work, but they'd decided to go with someone else, someone with more recent experience in whatever specific area they needed. The unemployment checks helped, but they weren't enough to cover rent and bills and food and everything else that life demanded. Her savings account, which had once felt like a comfortable cushion, started to drain away. First slowly, then faster than she could have imagined. She'd always been careful with money, always tried to put a little away each month, but she'd never planned for something like this. Nobody plans for everything to fall apart at once. Then her mother got sick. Cancer, the doctor said, and Sarah's world tilted on its axis. Her mother had always been there, always been the steady presence she could count on. Growing up, it had just been the two of them after her father left when Sarah was 7. Her mother had worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, had made sure Sarah had what she needed for school, had believed in her when she decided to go to college for design. Everything Sarah had become, she owed to that woman. So when the medical bills started coming, Sarah didn't hesitate. She paid what insurance wouldn't cover, drove her mother to appointments, sat with her through the treatments that left her weak and nauseous. She'd held her mother's hand through the worst of it and told her everything would be okay, even as her own bank account reached 0 and then went negative. Some things were more important than money. That's what she'd believed, what she still believed even now. Her mother had survived. She was in remission now. Living with Sarah's aunt 2 states away, getting stronger every day. That was worth everything. But the cost had been devastating. Between the medical expenses and the months of unemployment, Sarah had nothing left. Credit cards were maxed out. The small amount she'd managed to borrow from friends had been spent. When the divorce papers came, it felt like the universe had decided she hadn't suffered enough yet. She and Marcus had been married for 4 years, and she'd thought they were happy. Looking back now, she could see the cracks that had been there all along. The way he'd pulled away when things got hard, the resentment in his voice when she'd told him about another rejected job application. But she'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't seen what was happening until it was too late. He'd wanted out, and he'd taken what little they had left when he went. Their shared account had been emptied before she even knew he'd filed the papers. The apartment had been in her name, which meant the debt was too. She'd tried to explain to the landlord, had begged for more time, had promised she'd catch up on the back rent as soon as she found work. But landlords had bills to pay too, and promises weren't currency. The eviction notice had been inevitable. She'd known it was coming. That didn't make it any easier to hold in her hands. Her friend Jenny had offered to let her stay for a few days, and Sarah had accepted because she didn't have any other choice. But she could see the worry in Jenny's eyes, could hear the tension in her husband's voice when he came home to find Sarah still there on the third night. They had 2 small kids and a mortgage of their own. They were being kind, but kindness had limits. She couldn't impose on them forever. That's how she'd ended up sleeping in her car. Her old Honda wasn't much, but at least it ran. At least it gave her some shelter. She'd parked behind a grocery store that first night, reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, and tried to sleep. Every sound had made her jump. Every pair of headlights that swept across the parking lot had made her heart race, terrified it might be police or security telling her to move along. She'd never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, so utterly alone. By the third night, she was exhausted. Not just physically, though her back ached from sleeping in awkward positions and her neck was stiff. It was a deeper kind of tired, the kind that settled into your bones and made everything feel impossible. When the security guard tapped on her window that evening and told her she couldn't stay there, she'd just nodded and driven away. She was too tired to argue, too tired to explain, too tired to cry anymore. She'd found an industrial area on the edge of town where the streetlights were scattered and dim. There were no houses nearby, just warehouses and storage facilities that were empty after dark. It felt safer somehow, more private. She could disappear here, could pretend she was anywhere else. She parked her car under one of the few working streetlights, that old instinct for safety making her choose light over complete darkness, even if the light meant being more visible. The November air was cold, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the car. She'd wrapped herself in the jacket she'd been wearing and an old blanket she'd found in her trunk, but it wasn't enough. The chill seeped through everything, making her shiver. She thought about the apartment she'd left behind, about the warm bed and the working heater and all the small comforts she'd taken for granted. She thought about how quickly a life could unravel, how fast you could go from feeling secure to feeling like you were hanging on by your fingernails. She must have dozed off eventually because when she opened her eyes, the light outside had changed. Dawn was still a few hours away, but the quality of darkness was different. She sat up, her muscles protesting, and looked out at the industrial landscape around her. That's when she noticed the cardboard box near the dumpster about 20 feet away. It was strange the way it was positioned, not thrown carelessly like trash, but set carefully, almost deliberately. One of the flaps was folded back like an invitation. In the dim light from the street lamp, she could see that it wasn't just empty packaging. There was something inside. Sarah sat there for a long moment, just looking at it. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to start the car and drive somewhere else. But curiosity and something else, something harder to name, pulled at her. She was so cold, so tired, so completely worn down that even the smallest mystery felt like it mattered. She opened the car door and stepped out into the night air, her breath visible in the cold, and walked slowly toward the box. As she got closer, she could see more clearly. The box was clean, not dirty or waterlogged like trash would be. Someone had placed this here recently, and they'd done it on purpose. Her heart was beating faster now, though she couldn't have said exactly why. She knelt down beside the box and looked inside. What she saw made her throat tighten with emotion. The box was filled with supplies, things that someone living rough would need. A thick sleeping bag still in its compression sack, several cans of soup and vegetables with a manual can opener tucked beside them, bottles of water, a flashlight with batteries still in the package, toiletries, soap, toothpaste, a toothbrush, wet wipes, a prepaid phone card, and on top of everything, a handwritten note on lined paper, the writing careful and clear. Sarah picked up the note with trembling fingers and read it in the weak light from the street. For whoever needs this, you are seen. You matter. You are not forgotten. There's a community meal at Grace Church, 4th and Main Street every evening at 6 p.m. Come if you can. You don't have to be alone. Friend. That's when the tears came. Not the frustrated, angry tears she'd cried before, but something deeper. Something that came from a place she'd been trying to protect. Someone somewhere had cared enough to do this. They'd spent their own money, their own time to put together this box for a stranger they would never meet. They'd thought about what someone in desperate circumstances might need. They'd written a note that acknowledged the humanity of whoever might find it. Sarah sat back on the cold pavement, holding that note, and let herself cry. She cried for everything she'd lost, for the fear that had been her constant companion, for the loneliness that had been eating away at her. But she also cried because of this unexpected kindness, this proof that even in the darkest moments there were still people who cared, who saw, who reached out. She didn't know who had left this box. She might never know. But sitting there in the cold pre-dawn darkness, clutching a note from a stranger, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt seen. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she could survive this after all. Sarah spent the next 2 days living out of that box. She kept it in her car, rationing the supplies carefully, making each can of food last. The sleeping bag became her lifeline at night, the warm cocoon that made sleeping in the Honda bearable. She used the flashlight sparingly, aware that batteries wouldn't last forever. The wet wipes became her shower, the toothbrush and toothpaste small dignities that helped her feel human. But it was the note she returned to most often. She'd folded it carefully and kept it in her jacket pocket, and whenever the fear and shame threatened to overwhelm her, she'd take it out and read those words again. You are seen. You matter. You are not forgotten. They became a kind of mantra, a reminder that she wasn't as invisible as she felt. The address on the note kept pulling at her thoughts. Grace Church, 4th and Main Street community meal at 6 p.m. She'd driven past that area before, knew generally where it was. But the idea of actually going there, of walking into a place where people would know she needed help, made her stomach clench with anxiety. There was shame in needing help, even though logically she knew there shouldn't be. She'd always been the one who had it together, who helped others. Admitting she couldn't do this alone felt like admitting failure. On the 3rd day after finding the box, Sarah woke up in her car with the kind of headache that comes from not eating enough. She'd been stretching the food as far as she could, but her body was starting to protest. The last can of soup was gone, and so was most of the water. She had maybe $3 in change scattered across her dashboard and center console. $3 between her and complete destitution. She sat there for a long time, watching the morning light strengthen outside her windows, trying to decide what to do. Pride was a funny thing. It could keep you warm when you had nothing else, but it could also kill you. She thought about her mother, about the way she'd swallowed her pride over and over again when Sarah was growing up, working jobs that were beneath her education, accepting help from neighbors when things got too tight. Her mother had taught her that survival mattered more than ego. But knowing that and feeling it were two different things. By 5:30 that evening, Sarah found herself driving toward 4th and Main. She told herself she was just going to look, just going to see what this place was about. She didn't have to go in. She didn't have to talk to anyone. But even as she told herself these things, she knew she was lying. She was hungry, she was tired, and she was out of options. Grace Church was smaller than she'd expected. It wasn't one of those big, impressive buildings with spires and stained glass. It was a modest brick structure with a simple cross above the door and a painted wooden sign that had weathered several seasons. There was a side entrance with a ramp, and she could see people moving around inside through lit windows. Some were carrying covered dishes. Others were setting up tables. It looked busy but not chaotic. It looked, if she was being honest with herself, welcoming. Sarah parked across the street and sat in her car, watching. She saw all kinds of people going in. Some were clearly homeless, carrying backpacks or pushing shopping carts. Others looked like they might have homes but not much else, their clothes clean but worn. There were families with children, older people walking slowly, younger people with that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from working too hard for too little. No one was being turned away. No one was being questioned or judged at the door. At 5:55, she finally made herself get out of the car. She locked it carefully, even though there was nothing inside worth stealing anymore, and crossed the street. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She felt exposed, like everyone could see exactly what she was, exactly how far she'd fallen. But she made herself walk to that door, made herself reach for the handle, made herself step inside. The first thing that hit her was the smell. Food, real food, warm and savory. Her stomach cramped with sudden, desperate hunger. The second thing was the noise. Not loud exactly, but full of life. People talking, laughing, the clatter of dishes and utensils. The sound of community. A woman approached her almost immediately. She was older, maybe in her mid-60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore jeans and a sweater with a small name tag that read Pastor Coleman. She smiled at Sarah. and it was a real smile, not one of those pitying looks Sarah had been dreading. "Hi there," the woman said, her voice gentle. "First time joining us?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice yet. "Well, welcome. I'm Pastor Coleman, but everyone just calls me Pastor C. We're glad you're here." She gestured toward the large room beyond them, where tables were set up and people were already beginning to line up at a serving station. "We'll be starting in just a few minutes. The food's hot, there's plenty of it, and you can eat as much as you want. No questions, no judgments, no strings. You're a guest here, and we're honored to have you." Something about the way she said it, so matter-of-fact and kind, made Sarah's eyes sting with tears. She blinked them back and managed a quiet, "Thank you." Pastor Coleman touched her arm lightly. "Bathrooms are down that hall if you need them. Take your time. When you're ready, come join us." Then she moved on to greet someone else, giving Sarah space to collect herself. Sarah did use the bathroom, mostly just to have a moment alone. She looked at herself in the mirror over the sink. She looked tired, she thought. Worn down, but not destroyed. Not yet. She washed her hands and face with soap that smelled like lavender, used paper towels to dry off, and then made herself go back out to the main room. The line had formed, and Sarah joined it at the end. No one paid her much attention, which was somehow both a relief and oddly comforting. She wasn't special here. She wasn't particularly notable. She was just another person who needed a meal, and that was okay. When she got to the serving station, volunteers filled her plate with more food than she'd seen in days. Beef stew thick with vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the oven, a side salad, and a piece of apple pie for dessert. There was coffee and juice and water to drink. Sarah carried her tray to an empty spot at one of the long tables and sat down. That first bite of stew was almost overwhelming. It was hot and rich and delicious, and she had to force herself not to eat too fast, not to make herself sick. She'd heard about that, how eating too much too quickly after going without could make you ill. So she made herself take small bites, made herself pause between them, even though every instinct screamed at her to devour everything on her plate. "Food's good, isn't it?" Sarah looked up. The woman sitting across from her was probably in her 40s, with dark hair streaked with gray and a face that had seen hard years, but still held humor in the lines around her eyes. She was working her way through her own plate of stew. "It's amazing," Sarah said honestly. "Pastor C's got a gift for organizing these things. Half the food's donated, half she bullies local restaurants into contributing." The woman grinned. "I'm Maria, by the way." "Sarah." "Nice to meet you, Sarah. You look like you've got a story, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask. We've all got stories here." Maria took a bite of bread and chewed thoughtfully. "You sticking around after dinner?" "I don't know. I wasn't really planning beyond the meal." "Fair enough. But if you do stick around, there's a group that meets afterward. Nothing formal, nothing religious if that's not your thing. Just people talking, sharing resources, helping each other figure stuff out. Job leads, housing information, which social services offices are actually helpful, that kind of thing. No pressure, but you might find it useful." Sarah nodded slowly. The idea of sharing her situation with strangers still made her uncomfortable, but Maria's casual friendliness made it seem less daunting. "Maybe, I'll think about it. That's all anyone can ask." Maria finished her stew and stood up with her tray. "Either way, it was nice meeting you, Sarah. Hope I see you around." Sarah finished her own meal slowly, savoring every bite. The pie was homemade, sweet and tart at the same time, with a crust that flaked perfectly. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had dessert. Couldn't remember the last time food had tasted like something other than just fuel. She was still sitting there, drinking a second cup of coffee, when Pastor Coleman came over and sat down across from her. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there with her own cup of tea, comfortable in the silence. Finally she spoke. "I don't want to pry, but I do want you to know that if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. And if you need practical help, resources, connections to services, we can help with that too." She paused. "I've been where you are, you know. Different circumstances, maybe, but the same basic place. Nowhere to go, no idea how to move forward. That was 20 years ago, so I'm not speaking from theory here." Sarah looked at this woman with her kind eyes and tidy appearance and tried to imagine her homeless, desperate. It seemed impossible. But then again, people probably looked at Sarah and couldn't imagine her sleeping in a car either. Everyone had a story. Everyone had struggles that didn't show on the surface. "How did you get through it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Help," Pastor Coleman said simply. I accepted help even though it killed my pride. I let people care about me even when I felt like I didn't deserve it. And eventually, when I was back on my feet, I started helping others. That's why this place exists, because I remember what it's like to be hungry and scared and alone, and I decided that as long as I had breath in my body, I'd make sure nobody else had to feel that way if I could prevent it. Sarah felt the tears coming again and didn't try to stop them this time. They ran down her cheeks silently while Pastor Coleman sat across from her, not offering empty comfort, just being present. Finally, Sarah managed to speak. I found a box, she said. A cardboard box with supplies and a note. It had this address on it. That's why I came, Pastor Coleman smiled. The hope boxes, yes, I know about those. You left it? Maybe, maybe not. There are a lot of us who leave them, scattered around the city, people who've been helped and want to help in return. We don't take credit because that's not the point. The point is making sure people know they're not alone. She reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. You're not alone, Sarah, not anymore. If you'll let us, we'll walk with you through this, however long it takes. And sitting there in that church basement, surrounded by the gentle noise of people cleaning up after dinner, holding the hand of a woman who understood, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there. The shame was still there. But underneath it all, for the first time in months, there was something else. There was hope. Sarah did stay after dinner that night. The group that Maria had mentioned turned out to be about 15 people, gathered in a smaller room off the main hall. They sat in a circle on mismatched chairs, and there was more coffee and some cookies on a table against the wall. It felt casual, almost like a book club or a neighborhood meeting, except everyone here was fighting battles that didn't show on the surface. Maria led the discussion, and she started by asking if anyone had wins to share from the past week. Wins, she explained when she saw Sarah's confused expression, could be anything. A job lead, a night in a shelter bed instead of outside, a kindness from a stranger. Even just getting through a particularly hard day without giving up. The idea was to celebrate progress, no matter how small. A young man named Marcus, probably early 20s, shared that he'd gotten a call back for a dishwashing position at a restaurant. An older woman named Dorothy said she'd been approved for food stamps after months of being denied. A thin man with weary eyes who introduced himself only as James said his win was making it to the meeting. Because yesterday he hadn't been sure he'd make it through the night. When it came around to Sarah, she hesitated. Then she said quietly, I found a hope box and I came here tonight. That's my win. The nods around the circle were understanding, knowing. Several people said welcome or glad you're here. No one asked her to elaborate. No one pushed for her story. It was enough that she'd shown up. That, Sarah was beginning to understand, was always enough in this place. After the wins, people started sharing information. David, a social worker who volunteered his time, talked about a new emergency housing assistance program that had just opened up, and several people wrote down the details. A woman named Rosa mentioned that the grocery store where she worked was hiring, and she could put in a good word for anyone interested. Someone else shared that the public library had started offering free resume help on Tuesday afternoons. Sarah listened to all of it, trying to absorb the information, trying to map out what might be relevant to her situation. But more than the practical details, she found herself absorbing something else, the sense of community. These people helped each other. They shared resources, celebrated successes, and supported each other through failures. They weren't just individuals struggling alone. They were a network, a safety net woven from shared experience and genuine care. After the meeting ended, David approached her with a warm smile and a handshake. He was probably in his 30s, with kind eyes and an easy manner that made him approachable. Sarah, right? I'm David. Maria mentioned you might be dealing with some housing instability. Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment, but she nodded. I've been staying in my car. Okay, David said, his tone non-judgmental and businesslike. How long? About a week now. I got evicted from my apartment. Do you have any income right now? No, I lost my job 8 months ago. I've been looking, but she trailed off, feeling the familiar weight of failure settling on her shoulders. But the economy's tough and interviews aren't turning into offers. David finished for her. I hear that story a lot. It's not your fault, you know. The system's broken in about 50 different ways. He pulled out a battered notebook and a pen. What's your work background? Graphic design. I did marketing materials, brand development, digital content. I was good at it, she added, then felt embarrassed for sounding like she was bragging. I believe you, David said simply. Okay, here's what I'm thinking. First, immediate needs. You can't job hunt effectively if you're hungry and sleeping in a car. Have you applied for any assistance yet? Food stamps, emergency cash assistance, anything like that? Sarah shook her head. I didn't know how. And honestly, I kept thinking I'd find a job any day that I wouldn't need it. No shame in needing it, David said firmly. These programs exist for exactly this reason. I'm going to give you the information for the social services office I work with. Ask for Denise Martinez, tell her I sent you. She'll help you navigate the applications. It's complicated and bureaucratic and frustrating, but she's good at cutting through the red tape. He wrote down an address and phone number, then continued. Second, let's get you into better housing than your car. There's an emergency shelter for women about 2 miles from here. It's clean, safe, and the staff is good people. You can stay there while you're getting back on your feet. I'll give you that address too. A shelter, Sarah repeated. The word felt heavy in her mouth. A shelter meant admitting she was homeless, really homeless, not just temporarily between places. David must have read something in her expression because he said gently, I know shelters have a reputation and some of them earn it, but this one's different. Private rooms, lockers for your belongings, case managers who actually care, and most importantly, it's warm and safe. Your car is neither of those things, not really, not long term. He was right. Sarah knew he was right. Sleeping in the Honda had been miserable, even with the sleeping bag from the Hope box. And it was only going to get colder as winter deepened. She nodded slowly. Okay, I'll check it out. Good. David wrote down more information. Third, employment. I know a woman named Patricia who runs a temp agency. She specializes in placing people who've hit rough patches. She gets it. And she works with employers who get it too. The assignments aren't always glamorous, but they're legitimate work and they pay. I'm going to call her tomorrow and tell her about you.
Can you go see her this week?
Yes, Sarah said, feeling something like determination stirring in her chest. Yes, I can do that. Great. And Maria mentioned you have design experience. She runs a job training program here at the church, helps people build new skills or refresh old ones. She's particularly interested in finding people who can teach others. You might want to talk to her about that. Sarah took all the information David gave her, folding the papers carefully and tucking them into her jacket pocket alongside the note from the Hope box. By the time she left the church that night, her head was spinning with possibilities, but in a good way. She had next steps. She had people willing to help. She had a path forward, even if it was narrow and uncertain. The next morning, Sarah drove to the women's shelter David had recommended. It was in an older building that had clearly been renovated, with fresh paint and security cameras and a buzzer system at the door. A woman named Linda, probably in her 50s with a no-nonsense manner and a surprisingly warm smile, showed her around. The room Sarah would stay in was small but clean, with a single bed, a dresser, and a small desk under a window. The sheets were fresh and there was a warm blanket folded at the foot of the bed. The bathroom was shared but well maintained. There was a common kitchen, a laundry room, and a quiet space for reading or just sitting. Rules were posted clearly. No drugs or alcohol, no violence, respect for other residents and staff. Curfew at 10 p.m. with exceptions for work schedules. You can stay for up to 90 days, Linda explained. That gives you time to find work, save up for a deposit on a place, get stabilized. We have case managers on staff who'll help you with applications, job searches, whatever you need. Sound like something you can work with? Sarah looked around the room again. It wasn't home. It wasn't even close to home. But it was safe and warm, and that was more than she'd had in weeks. Yes, she said. Thank you, yes. She moved in that afternoon. It didn't take long, seeing as everything she owned fit in her car. She brought her few boxes inside, stored them in the room, and then took a shower in the communal bathroom that was so hot and lasted so long she felt almost guilty. But she needed it, needed to feel clean, needed to wash away not just the dirt but some of the despair. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's life began to develop a rhythm. She went to the social services office and met Denise, who was as helpful as David had promised. Within 2 weeks, Sarah was approved for food stamps and emergency cash assistance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stop the constant panic about where her next meal would come from. She went to see Patricia at the temp agency. Patricia was a brisk, efficient woman in her 50s who looked at Sarah's resume, asked a few pointed questions, and then started making calls right there in front of her. Within 3 days, Sarah had her first assignment, data entry at an insurance company, 30 hours a week, minimum wage. It wasn't design work, wasn't creative, wasn't challenging, but it was legitimate employment and it paid. Sarah threw herself into that job with an intensity that probably wasn't necessary for entering data, but she couldn't help it. She showed up early, stayed late when they'd let her, double-checked her work for errors. She needed this. Needed to prove she could still function, still be reliable, still be someone an employer could count on. Her supervisor, a woman named Helen who managed the data entry department, noticed. After 2 weeks, she called Sarah into her office and Sarah's heart sank, certain she'd done something wrong. But Helen just smiled and said, "You're doing good work here, Sarah. Patricia told me you were going through a rough time. I want you to know that if you need anything, if you need to talk to someone, my door's open. And if you're interested in more hours, I can probably make that happen." More hours meant more money, meant getting closer to being able to afford a place of her own again. "Yes," Sarah said. "I'm definitely interested in more hours." Through all of this, Sarah kept going back to Grace Church. The community meals became a regular part of her week, not because she couldn't afford food anymore, but because she'd come to value the community itself. She sat with Maria and Dorothy and Marcus and James and others whose names she learned and whose stories she gradually heard in pieces. Maria did ask her about teaching design skills, and Sarah agreed to lead a workshop one evening a week. It was strange at first, standing in front of a group and explaining things she'd once done without thinking about. But as she taught, she found herself remembering why she'd loved design in the first place. The way you could take something ordinary and make it communicate, make it sing, make it matter. Teaching reminded her of who she'd been before everything fell apart, and it gave her hope that she could be that person again. One evening, about a month after she'd first walked through the doors of Grace Church, Pastor Coleman asked if they could talk privately. They went to her small office and the pastor gestured for Sarah to sit. "I've been watching you," Pastor Coleman said, and Sarah must have looked alarmed because she quickly added, "In a good way, I've been watching you come back from a dark place. You're doing the work, Sarah. You're accepting help, you're helping others, you're putting one foot in front of the other even when it's hard. That takes courage." "I don't feel very courageous," Sarah admitted. "I feel like I'm barely holding it together most days." "That's what courage is," Pastor Coleman said. "Holding it together when everything in you wants to fall apart. Now, I wanted to talk to you about something. We need someone to help coordinate our volunteer schedules and do some basic graphic design work for our outreach materials. Flyers, social media posts, that kind of thing. It's only part-time and the pay isn't great, but it's steady. Are you interested?" Sarah stared at her. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity. There's a difference. You'd still need to interview with our board, still need to prove you can do the work. But yes, I'm suggesting you apply. I think you'd be good at it, and I think it might be good for you too. Design work. Real design work, not just teaching it, but actually doing it." Sarah felt something unfurl in her chest, something that felt dangerously like joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'm interested. Thank you." That night, lying in her narrow bed at the shelter, Sarah thought about how far she'd come in just a few weeks. She still didn't have her own place. She still had debt she couldn't pay and a credit score that was probably destroyed. She still had a long way to go before she could say she'd rebuilt her life. But she had food in her stomach and a safe place to sleep. She had work that used her hands and her mind. She had people who cared whether she showed up, who celebrated her small victories, who stood with her on bad days. She thought about the cardboard box that had started all of this, about the note that had led her to Grace Church. "You are seen. You matter. You are not forgotten." She'd been so lost when she'd found that box, so certain she was alone, but she hadn't been alone. People had been there, had been waiting, had been ready to help if she could just find the courage to accept it. Sarah fell asleep that night thinking that maybe the box hadn't just contained supplies. Maybe it had contained something more important, a reminder that she was part of something larger than herself, part of a community of people who understood struggle and chose compassion anyway. That was worth more than any material thing could ever be. That was what had saved her. That was hope. 3 months after Sarah first walked into Grace Church, her life looked completely different. She'd gotten the job Pastor Coleman had mentioned, working 20 hours a week coordinating volunteers and creating promotional materials for the church's various outreach programs. Combined with her hours at the insurance company, she was working full-time and earning enough to start saving. The work at the church was exactly what she needed. It wasn't just a paycheck, though she desperately needed that. It was a reminder of who she was, what she was capable of. When she designed a flyer for the community meal program that brought in 12 new volunteers, when she created a social media campaign that increased donations by 30%, she felt like herself again. Like the version of Sarah who had confidence and skills and something to contribute to the world. She'd moved out of the shelter 2 weeks earlier, into a small studio apartment in an older building on the east side of town. It wasn't fancy. The carpet was worn and the kitchen was barely more than a closet with a stove and mini fridge. But it was hers. She'd signed the lease, paid the deposit with money she'd earned herself, and moved in with a sense of accomplishment that was almost overwhelming. Her first night in that apartment, she'd sat on the floor with pizza from the dollar menu and just looked around at the empty space. She didn't have much furniture yet, just an air mattress and a few second-hand items from the church's donation closet. But she had walls that belonged to her, a door she could lock, a place where she could breathe without worrying that someone would tell her to move along. She'd called her mother that night, the first time she'd talked to her in weeks. She hadn't wanted to burden her with the truth of how bad things had gotten, had made excuses about why they couldn't video chat, had kept conversations short. But now, with her own place and steady work, she'd felt ready to be honest. "I'm proud of you, baby," her mother had said, her voice still a little weak from the treatments but strong enough to convey all the love Sarah had always known was there. "I'm proud that you kept going. That's all we can ever do, just keep going." Work at the insurance company had become easier too, in the way that routine always makes things easier. Helen had been true to her word about more hours, and Sarah now worked nearly full-time in data entry. It still wasn't her dream job, but Helen had started asking her opinion on department procedures, had let her redesign the filing system to make it more efficient. Small things, but they made Sarah feel valued. She'd also started picking up freelance design work, little projects here and there. A logo for a friend of Maria's who was starting a small business, a website mock-up for someone she'd met at church. The pay wasn't much yet, but it was building her portfolio back up, reminding potential clients that she still existed, that she was still good at what she did. But the biggest change wasn't in her circumstances. It was in how she saw the world. Before everything had fallen apart, Sarah had lived in a bubble of relative security. She'd known intellectually that poverty and homelessness existed, but she'd never understood it, not really, not in the bone-deep way you understand something you've lived through. Now she saw things differently. She noticed the people sleeping in doorways, the ones pushing shopping carts with all their possessions, the ones standing on corners with cardboard signs. She noticed them not as problems or statistics or things to look away from, but as people with stories, with dignity, with reasons for being where they were, people who deserved more than judgment and pity, people who deserved what she'd received, a chance, some help, and someone willing to see their humanity. One evening after her shift at the church, Sarah was walking to her car when Pastor Coleman caught up with her. "Do you have a minute?" the pastor asked. Of course. They walked together in comfortable silence for a moment before Pastor Coleman spoke. "I wanted to tell you something about the hope boxes, about how they started." She paused, gathering her thoughts. 20 years ago, when I was homeless, someone left a box for me too. Different contents, same idea. Supplies and a note telling me where I could find help. That box saved my life. Not just the physical things in it, but what it represented. The knowledge that someone cared enough to do that for a stranger. Sarah listened, fascinated. She'd wondered about the origin of the hope boxes, but hadn't wanted to pry. "When I got back on my feet," Pastor Coleman continued, "I wanted to do something similar for someone else. So I started leaving boxes, just one at a time, in places where I thought someone who needed help might find them. And then something interesting happened. The people I helped when they got stable again, some of them started doing the same thing, not because I asked them to, but because they wanted to pass on what they'd received. So it's like a chain," Sarah said slowly. "People helping people who help people." Exactly. And the beautiful thing is, nobody knows the whole chain. Nobody knows exactly how many people have been helped or how far the impact has spread. We just do our part and trust that it matters. Pastor Coleman looked at Sarah with those wise, kind eyes. I'm telling you this because I think you might want to know, and because I think maybe you're ready to add your own link to the chain." The idea settled into Sarah's mind and stayed there. Over the next few days, she found herself thinking about it constantly. What would it mean to leave a hope box for someone else? What would it mean to take the help she'd received and multiply it? She thought about what had helped her most in those dark early days. Yes, the practical supplies had been essential, but what had really made the difference was the note. The message that she wasn't alone, that someone saw her, that there was a path forward. And then the people at the church, the community that had wrapped around her and held her up when she couldn't hold herself up. Sarah started small. She took $20 from her paycheck, money she really couldn't afford to spare but couldn't afford not to give, and went to the dollar store. She bought socks because she'd learned that clean, dry socks were worth their weight in gold when you were living rough. Granola bars because they were filling and didn't need preparation. A cheap but functional flashlight. Wet wipes. A bottle of water. She added things from her own apartment. A blanket she didn't need, some travel-sized toiletries she'd accumulated. She put everything in a cardboard box, one of the moving boxes she still had from leaving her old apartment, and then she sat down with a piece of paper and a pen, and she thought about what to write. What had the note in her hope box said? "You are seen. You matter. You are not forgotten." Those words had been lifelines for her. But Sarah wanted to add something of her own, something from her specific experience. She wrote slowly, carefully, trying to put into words what she'd learned. "For whoever needs this, you are not alone. What you're going through right now doesn't define you. It's just a chapter, not the whole story. There are people who want to help. Grace Church 4th and Main Street community meal every evening at 6 p.m. Go if you can. They helped me and I'm going to make it. You can too." A friend who's been there. She folded the note and placed it on top of the supplies. Then she sat looking at the box, this simple cardboard container that held so much more than its contents. It held hope. It held connection. It held the message that someone somewhere cared. Sarah waited until late Friday night, the same night of the week when she'd found her own hope box. She drove to the industrial area where her car had been parked that desperate night. The place looked the same, still mostly deserted after dark, still lit by scattered streetlights that created more shadows than illumination. She parked and got out, carrying her box. Her heart was beating fast, though she couldn't have said exactly why. This felt important, ceremonial almost. She walked to a spot near a dumpster where someone might park if they didn't want to be noticed, and she set the box down carefully. She folded back one of the flaps so the contents would be visible to anyone who looked. Then she stood there for a moment, just looking at it. She didn't know who would find it. Maybe no one would. Maybe it would sit there until morning when someone threw it away as trash. But maybe, just maybe, someone in desperate need would see it, would open it, would read the note and feel a little less alone. Sarah got back in her car and drove away, not looking back. She didn't need to see what happened next. That wasn't the point. The point was doing it, being one more link in a chain of compassion that stretched back to whenever the first person had decided to help a stranger in need. She started making it a weekly ritual. Every Friday night, she'd put together a hope box with whatever she could afford that week. Sometimes it was more elaborate, sometimes just a few basic supplies. But there was always a note, always her handwritten message that someone out there cared. She varied where she left them, driving to different parts of the city, places where she thought someone living rough might be, behind grocery stores, near highway underpasses, in parks that emptied out at night. She became attuned to these spaces, learning to see her city through different eyes, through the eyes of people trying to survive on its margins. One evening at the church, she mentioned what she'd been doing to Maria. She half expected Maria to think it was silly or inefficient, that the money would be better spent donated to formal programs. But Maria just smiled and said, "Welcome to the club. You leave hope boxes too?" "Have been for 3 years now. Ever since I got my first paycheck after being homeless. It's funny. I always wondered if anyone actually found them, if they helped." Maria's eyes were warm. "And then you showed up, telling Pastor C about a box you'd found. That's when I knew it was all worth it." "It was you?" Sarah felt her eyes welling with tears. "You left my box?" "Maybe. Maybe it was someone else. We don't usually tell each other when or where we leave them. Like Pastor C said, the anonymity is part of it." Maria squeezed Sarah's hand. "But whether it was me specifically or not doesn't matter. What matters is the chain kept going. You found help, you got stable, and now you're helping someone else. That's how it's supposed to work. Sarah thought about that a lot in the following weeks. The idea that she'd been helped by someone who'd been helped by someone who'd been helped by someone, stretching back in an unbroken line of compassion. And now she was part of that line, helping the next person, who might someday help the person after that. It changed how she thought about her own struggle. It wasn't just a private tragedy anymore. It wasn't just her personal failure and redemption. It was part of something larger, a story about how people could lift each other up even when they barely had the strength to stand themselves. 4 months after finding her own hope box, Sarah was leaving her weekly box when she saw someone across the parking lot. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, sitting in an old sedan. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the defeat in her posture, the exhaustion. She looked exactly like Sarah had looked that night. Sarah placed her hope box in its usual careful way and turned to leave. But something made her pause. She looked back at the woman in the car, then at the box. Part of her wanted to go over, to talk to the woman, to tell her directly that help was available. But she remembered how ashamed she'd felt, how the last thing she'd wanted was someone knowing the extent of her desperation. So instead, Sarah did something she'd never done before. She stood by her own car in clear view and waited. She made it obvious she'd left the box, made it obvious she was there, and then she waited to see what would happen. The woman in the sedan noticed her. Sarah could see her tense, probably worried about being asked to leave or being hassled. But Sarah just gave a small wave, not threatening, not demanding anything. Then she pointed at the hope box, a clear gesture. That's for you. That's for anyone who needs it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the woman's car door opened and she got out slowly. Cautiously, she approached the box like it might be a trap. And Sarah's heart ached, recognizing that fear. She knew that feeling. The sense that nothing good could possibly be meant for you.